Hey everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Welcome to The Last Hike. Today we're looking at a man who hired one of the best guides he can find and then decided to cross the most dangerous section of the route alone during a record-breaking heat wave. His refusal to follow the plan would leave him alone on a valley floor where every mile made rescue less likely and survival less possible. It was June 28, 2018, Panamint Valley, California. A flat open basin of gravel and salt flats pressed between two mountain ranges, sitting at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level with no shade anywhere on the floor and no water anywhere on the surface. A heat warning had been in effect for the region since June 26th. Furnace Creek, 20 miles to the northeast, had already hit 122 degrees the day before. It was going to get worse. Jeevan Driscoll was 46 years old. He grew up in Odessa and went straight into the oil fields after high school. Over the next 2 decades, he worked his way up from roughneck to crew supervisor and eventually built his own independent contracting outfit operating across the Permian Basin. By 2018, the business had reached a solid mid-sized scale. He was servicing active drill sites across West Texas, managing crews, bidding contracts, and keeping equipment running in conditions most people would consider genuinely brutal. And the conditions really were brutal. Summers in the Permian Basin run hot from May through September. 12-hour shifts on open drill pads in temperatures that regularly hit 105 or 108 degrees, all while wearing flame-resistant clothing that trapped heat against the body. There were hourly breaks, cooling trailers on the better run sites, and constant hydration protocols. Heat stress was a known part of the job. Heavy sweating, nausea, dizziness, and Driscoll had spent nearly 20 years working through it himself and helping crews do the same. He wasn't a man who spent his days in an air-conditioned office. He was physically fit, a non-smoker, and usually ran a few miles in the mornings when he was between contracts. To him, suffering through heat wasn't some abstract thing that people wrote books about. It was part of the job. The Death Valley crossing had been on his mind for about 8 months. He talked about it to people around him as a personal benchmark, something physical, something most people couldn't do, something that had nothing to do with work, money, or managing other people. Just him and the terrain. He took the planning seriously. He read first-hand accounts, studied routes, and spent time understanding what a crossing like that actually involved. Once he felt he had a handle on it, he went looking for the best guide he could find, and he found one. The guide he hired had spent more than 15 years running private backcountry trips in Death Valley. He was fully authorized to operate there and had the experience to back it up. He'd completed versions of the same corridor crossing before, always during the cooler months and always with clients who stuck to the schedule. The fee came to $80,000. That covered custom gear, pre-cached supply waypoints at 3 locations along the route, satellite communication equipment, and a fully mapped corridor from the Panamint Valley floor eastward to stovepipe wells over 3 days. Driscoll paid without negotiating. The way he saw it, writing the check wasn't the hard part. The hard part was still waiting for him out in the desert. The pre-trip briefing happened 2 weeks before departure. The guide walked Driscoll through the route in detail: daily distances, waypoint locations, the water allocation schedule, the movement windows, the midday halt protocol. He explained the reasoning behind every element. He was direct about the forecast window they were entering. Late June in Death Valley is not a gray area. It is the most dangerous time of year in one of the most dangerous places in the country, and the guide said exactly that. Driscoll's response, according to the guide's later account, was measured. He asked good questions. He engaged with the logistics. But he kept returning to the schedule, specifically to the midday halt windows. He said he'd worked through worse. The guide told him that what he'd worked through and what they were walking into were not the same thing. It's a surprisingly common mistake. Experience with one kind of hardship can make people assume that they're prepared for a completely different one. The Panamint Valley floor sits at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level, caught between 2 mountain ranges that trap and compress hot air against the ground around the clock. The basin absorbs solar radiation all day and releases it slowly through the night. In late June 2018, overnight lows in the region were holding between 88 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about what that means for a moment. The coolest it got, at any point during the night, was nearly 90 degrees. There was no recovery window. The body never got a chance to reset. Every morning, Driscoll woke up already behind. The human body's core temperature sits at around 98.6 degrees. It starts struggling above 102. Heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, weakness, nausea, rapid pulse typically appears between 101 and 104 degrees. Heat stroke, where the body's cooling system begins to fail, starts above 104. Once that line is crossed, things can unravel quickly. Confusion comes first, then disorientation. Then the loss of coordination. Eventually, the body stops being able to do basic things it normally takes for granted. What most people don't realize is that the brain starts slipping long before that point. Even mild dehydration can impair attention, concentration, and short-term memory. Navigation becomes less reliable. Decisions take longer. The brain starts missing things it would normally catch. And in Death Valley, during a record heat event, that decline doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly while you're still convinced you're fine. A man who has worked in 108-degree heat in West Texas has no physiological advantage in 129-degree air over a valley floor, radiating over 160 degrees at his feet. The body does not build tolerance to temperatures that exceed its ability to cool itself. It just fails faster or slower depending on hydration, exertion level, and how long the exposure lasts. Driscoll had spent 20 years believing he was heat-hardened. He wasn't wrong about West Texas. He was completely wrong about Death Valley. What made Driscoll vulnerable wasn't a lack of competence. In some ways, it was the confidence that competence had earned him. The guide's plan was built around one non-negotiable rule: no movement between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The morning window ran from 3:30 to 8:30. 5 hours of movement in pre-dawn and early morning conditions before the valley floor became untenable. He carried 2 portable shade shelters specifically designed for midday halts in exposed terrain. Water was allocated at 1 liter per hour of movement, the minimum for extreme heat conditions, with mandatory electrolyte intake at every rest stop. 3 pre-cached waypoints along the route held additional supply. Every single element of that plan existed because the guide had spent 15 years watching what this place does when people improvise. One thing that always surprises me about wilderness travel is how much of it comes down to restraint. Knowing when not to move can matter more than knowing how. Day 1, June 28, 2018. The high at Furnace Creek, roughly 20 miles to the northeast, was 122 degrees. They started at 3:30 in the morning. The valley floor before dawn has a strange, disorienting quality to it. Death Valley has some of the darkest skies in the country, almost no artificial light nearby, and out on the flat open basin, the ground and horizon seem to blend together. You navigate by the dark outlines of the mountain ranges on either side, and by whatever instruments you're carrying. The guide relied on a compass and a GPS unit. Even at 3:30 a.m., the air was already 89 degrees. Not cool, not comfortable. Just less dangerous than it would be a few hours later. They covered roughly 9 miles before stopping for the midday halt and reached the first waypoint in good condition. Driscoll moved well. There was never much question about his physical capability. But throughout the morning, he kept comparing the heat to job sites in Midland and Odessa. He called the pace conservative. At one point during the midday rest, he asked whether they could keep moving through the afternoon window instead of waiting. The guide explained the reasoning again. Cumulative dehydration, ground radiation, the difference between air temperature and the radiant heat coming off the valley floor, where the ground was pushing well over 150 degrees into their legs. Driscoll listened. He didn't press the issue any further that day. But the guide made a note of it. That night, the temperature didn't drop below 90 degrees. Driscoll slept, but not deeply. The heat doesn't let you. You lie still, and your body keeps working, keeps trying to regulate, keeps spending resources it needs for the next day. By the time the alarm went off, he had already been in the heat for hours without moving. Day 2, June 29, 2018. High of 128 degrees at Furnace Creek. The guide moved the morning start to 3 a.m. to account for the climbing forecast. Driscoll was up and ready, which the guide noted positively. They moved in the pre-dawn dark across the gravel floor, headlamps cutting a narrow path through terrain that was flat but uneven loose rock, shallow wash channels, scattered low scrub that was hard to see until you were on top of it. The Panamint Range was visible to the east as a broad black mass against the slightly lighter sky. That's your landmark on the valley floor at night. A silhouette, not a precise bearing, a general direction. During the morning movement window, Driscoll started making small adjustments of his own. He skipped one of the scheduled water stops, saying he wasn't thirsty. On 2 separate stretches, he drifted slightly ahead of the pace the guide had set, not by much, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but enough for it to become noticeable. At one point, he reconfigured his pack without mentioning it. None of those things were dangerous on their own, but the guide had been doing this long enough to recognize the pattern. It usually meant a client had started believing, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they understood the situation better than the plan did. By the end of the morning window on day 2, the guide noticed a few early signs that the heat was starting to accumulate. Driscoll's resting heart rate was a little higher than it had been the day before. He had less appetite. He was slower to rehydrate during the midday halt. None of it would have been alarming by itself. With the forecast for the following day, it was enough to get the guide's attention. During the midday break, he brought up the skipped water stop directly. He reminded Driscoll that thirst isn't a reliable signal in extreme heat. By the time you actually feel thirsty, you're often already running a meaningful deficit. Driscoll said he understood. Then he asked how far behind schedule they would be if they took the entire midday halt. The question itself wasn't unreasonable. It was the fact that he was still thinking about time after everything else they'd discussed. That evening, June 29th, the guide sat down with Driscoll and walked him through the next day's forecast in detail. June 30th was expected to be the peak of the heat event. Furnace Creek was forecast to reach 129 degrees Fahrenheit. The next section of the route was a 6-mile crossing of completely open valley floor, the most exposed stretch of the entire trip. There was no natural shade, no practical bailout option once they were committed, and no meaningful landmarks at ground level to navigate by. The guide suggested they hold position for 24 hours and let the worst of the heat pass. He explained his reasoning clearly and didn't soften the risk. Driscoll refused. He said they were on schedule and intended to stay on schedule. He said he'd been through worse. The trouble with experience is that it gives us something to compare everything else against. Sometimes the comparison fits, sometimes it doesn't. The guide documented the conversation in his log. He wrote down the time. He noted that the client had been informed of the forecast and the associated risks in explicit terms and had declined to alter the plan. That night, the temperature hovered around 92 degrees. By then, Driscoll's body had spent 2 straight nights in heat that never dropped below 90. His fluid balance, electrolyte levels, and ability to regulate core temperature were all operating at a deficit before June 30th had even begun. He didn't know that. What he felt was tired, the kind of tired that follows a couple of hard days of physical work. It was a familiar feeling. He dealt with it before. He knew how to push through tired. At 4:22 a.m. on June 30th, the guide got up to begin the morning preparations and noticed that Driscoll's sleeping spot was empty. His pack was gone. Of the 4 1-liter water containers staged at the waypoint for the next leg, the guide's calculated minimum for a 6-mile crossing under the forecast conditions, 2 were missing. The other 2 were still sitting there. His satellite phone had been left on the ground next to his sleeping mat, powered off. His GPS watch, however, was still on his wrist. He had left on his own. He had left in the dark, carrying half the water the guide had planned for the crossing. He had no navigation equipment and no way to call for help, and he was heading east across 6 miles of open valley floor on what was expected to be the hottest day of the year. The guide radioed for assistance at 4:35 a.m. and immediately started moving east. Records later showed that Driscoll had left camp at 3:48 a.m. The air temperature in the Panamint Valley at that hour was approximately 91 degrees, already warm, already pulling moisture from the body with every breath. Under his boots, the valley floor was a mix of hard-packed gravel and stretches of pale salt crust, still releasing heat stored during 2 consecutive days of record temperatures. His pace held at roughly 3 miles per hour. It was steady and purposeful. The GPS track showed him moving straight east, closely aligned with the intended route. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Panamint Range appeared as a black silhouette on the horizon, a useful reference point, but not a precise bearing. Without a compass or a GPS unit of his own, Driscoll was navigating by instinct and the outline of the mountains, much the way he might have found his way around a dark job site back in Texas. Up to that point in his life, that approach had always worked. Driscoll probably felt like he was making up time. In reality, he was trading water, energy, and body temperature for every mile. At approximately 4:28 a.m., the GPS track began to drift, about 8 degrees south of the intended bearing. It was a gradual shift, the kind that would have been almost impossible to notice in the dark. On flat, featureless terrain, being 8 degrees off course doesn't feel like anything. The ground looks the same no matter which direction you're facing. The mountains are still roughly where you expect them to be. As far as you can tell, you're heading exactly where you're supposed to go. So he kept moving. By 5:15 a.m., he was 2.1 miles from camp and already 4/10 of a mile south of the intended route. The sun was starting to come up. The air temperature had climbed to 108 degrees. His pace was still close to 3 miles per hour. The GPS track shows no stops during this period. He kept moving steadily, with no hesitation and no indication that he thought anything was wrong. This was the point where something should have tipped him off, but apparently nothing did. The sun was rising in the east, directly ahead of him on the intended bearing. A man with 20 years of outdoor work behind him would normally use something like that as a rough check on direction, yet the drift continued even as the light improved. Maybe the terrain gave him no reason to question where he was going. Maybe the effects of heat and dehydration were already beginning to narrow his focus. Most likely, it was some combination of the two.
Being lost and realizing you're lost are two very different things. Driscoll had already done the first without yet reaching the second.
Meanwhile, something else was happening inside his body, whether he noticed it or not. After 2.5 miles of exertion in 108-degree heat, carrying a pack on a body that had already spent 2 nights in near 90-degree temperatures without fully recovering, his fluid deficit was growing. Under those conditions, sweat loss can reach roughly 1 to 1.2 liters per hour. He had started with 2 liters. The numbers were already moving in the wrong direction. His pace dropped to around 1.8 miles per hour. The sun was fully up now, and the air temperature was climbing past 112 degrees. Underfoot, the valley floor had shifted from hard gravel to stretches of pale salt crust that reflected sunlight and pushed heat back upward with every step. Surface temperatures were approaching 150 degrees. By then, he was more than 0.8 of a mile south of the intended route and drifting farther away with each step. The mountain silhouettes that had helped orient him in the dark no longer offered much guidance. From the middle of the valley floor, they looked much the same from almost any position. There was nothing obvious to correct against. No road, no building, no tree, nothing. By this point, his 2 liters of water were almost certainly gone. He had been moving for roughly 90 minutes in steadily rising heat, carrying a body that was already starting from a fluid deficit built up over the previous 2 days. The sweating that had been keeping him cool was becoming less effective as his reserves dropped. His heart was working harder to move thickening blood through vessels that were beginning to narrow. His core temperature was rising. He was sweating heavily. His heart rate was elevated. His legs were beginning to feel the particular kind of heaviness that comes with heat exhaustion, not ordinary muscle fatigue, but something deeper, something that doesn't simply go away because you decide to push harder. He had felt versions of it before on job sites.
In West Texas, you find some shade, drink water, sit down for 20 minutes, and eventually it passes. Out here, there was no shade.
The water was gone, and the temperature was still climbing. His pace dropped below 1 mile per hour. The GPS data shows 2 full stops, each lasting somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. That's consistent with someone sitting down to rest. By then, he was 1.2 miles south of the route. The air temperature had reached 118 degrees. Surface temperatures on the salt crust were above 160. He had no water left. It's worth pausing on what that number actually means. 160 degrees wasn't the air temperature, it was the surface he was sitting on during those stops. The salt crust beneath him was radiating heat upward into his body while the air pressed down from above. There was nowhere to move that wasn't hot.
Those stops are significant for another reason. One of the early neurological effects of heat stroke is impaired judgment, particularly the inability to accurately assess your own condition.
People in the early stages often believe they just need a few minutes of rest and will feel better afterward. They sit down expecting to get back up and continue. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the body has already crossed a threshold they can't recognize. Driscoll sat down. Then he got back up and continued walking in the same wrong direction. The GPS track shows a final stretch of less than 1/3 of a mile at a pace below 0.5 mile per hour. By this point, the track was no longer straight. It drifted slightly south, then corrected slightly north, then wandered south again. That kind of irregular movement is consistent with ataxia, the loss of coordinated muscle control that often accompanies severe heat stroke. The brain is no longer sending clean signals to the muscles. The body is still capable of moving, but it is no longer navigating with any real precision. It is simply continuing forward. At 7:02 a.m., the GPS watch recorded its final position. The last location was 1.4 miles south-southwest of the intended route, out on the open floor of Panamint Valley. The terrain was a mix of salt crust and gravel. There was no shade visible in any direction. An empty water container lay beside him. At that hour, the air temperature at Furnace Creek was already 118 degrees and still climbing toward the day's projected high of 129. Surface temperatures where he stopped were estimated to be above 160 degrees. The GPS data doesn't show a collapse or any sudden event. Instead, it shows a pace that had been steadily declining for nearly 2 hours, finally reaching 0 and never increasing again. The guide's radio call at 4:35 a.m. had already set a search effort in motion. But the size of the terrain and the rapidly increasing heat created immediate challenges. By 8 a.m., conditions on the open valley floor were becoming dangerous even for search personnel. An aerial search was organized. A helicopter located Driscoll at 9:47 a.m., 5 hours and 9 minutes after he had left camp. He was found face down on the valley floor, 1.4 miles from the intended route. He was unresponsive. Ground crews reached him shortly afterward, and he was transported immediately. He was pronounced dead. His time of death was estimated to have occurred between 7 and 8 a.m., consistent with the data recorded by the GPS watch. Jivan Driscoll was 46 years old. He was found on the floor of Panamint Valley on the morning of June 30th, 2018, the same day Furnace Creek recorded 129 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest June temperature ever reliably measured on Earth. He had been moving alone across exposed terrain for approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. He had no shade, no communication device, no navigation equipment, and only half the water the crossing called for. He was found 1.4 miles from where he was supposed to be. The post-mortem examination determined the cause of death to be hyperthermia, exertional heat stroke complicated by acute dehydration. The autopsy findings themselves were largely unremarkable. There was mild cerebral edema and clear evidence of significant dehydration, but no pre-existing cardiac disease, vascular disease, or other underlying condition that contributed to his death. By all available evidence, he had been physically healthy. The death was ruled accidental. The official findings cited several contributing factors: separating from the guided group before the designated movement window, carrying an inadequate water supply for the forecast conditions, traveling without personal navigation equipment, leaving the satellite communication device behind and powered off, and sustained exertion on exposed terrain during a record heat event. The guide was cleared of any negligence. His permits, radio logs, and field notes documented the warnings he gave, the risks he explained, and the decisions Driscoll made on his own during the final 48 hours of the trip. The evidence that closed the case was remarkably consistent. The GPS watch provided position points at roughly 1-minute intervals, creating a record of his route from departure to the point where he stopped moving. The satellite phone's final sync, recorded the previous evening, confirmed his position at the waypoint. The guide's radio logs established the timeline of the search and response. 2 unused water containers remained at camp. 1 empty container was recovered at the scene. Partial boot prints preserved in softer sections of the salt crust matched the direction and distance of his deviation from the intended route. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Driscoll hadn't died because he was weak, reckless, or unprepared. He died because, for the very first time in a very long time, the experience he trusted wasn't enough for the place he was in.